first and foremost, the responsibility of government is to protect its citizens. There was a lot of issues that came out of this. The French intelligence services and police may have dropped the ball on this, but it's very, very difficult. I was noting that there's about 2,500 personnel in the French intelligence organization domestically. I don't know how many are externally, but they've got over some, depending on who you believe, anywhere between 2,000 plus targets in France alone. So if you look at the numbers of targets, and if they're being monitored 24/7, generally speaking, you need between 16 and 25 intelligence personnel per target. Now you can see where the problem is for France. Resources. You don't want a police state, but at the same time, one has to be very cognizant that the threat is there, in particular in those numbers. The other issue is that they're going to be doing some serious soul searching domestically. They've got millions of Muslims in France, depending who you believe, between 4 and 5 million. That's a substantial number. A lot of these people have been marginalized historically. So how are you going to deal with that issue? Because there's an economic, social, cultural, and religious issue that you have to deal with in those terms. As far as an organization, ISIS, who has basically applauded their attack, and they've been very, very impressive. I hate to say this in those terms, but to coordinate a number of attacks in one night, essentially in the military term, it's a one-way mission. A number of the protagonists were killed, and by their own hand, I may add, with the exception of one. And I gather from reports they're still looking for others. There's an issue of the logistics, obviously the intelligence that was being produced during that time period prior to the events, all lends itself to a well-orchestrated, well-planned operation. And so I think France has to deal with it legally, and I think the French government, by declaring it essentially a state of war, this is going to have an impact upon Canada and our NATO allies, quite frankly, because that brings in Article 5 of the NATO agreement, which is attack on one is attack on all. So I'll be very interested to see how the Canadian government and indeed our Prime Minister responds to this threat. Because we're a part of that coalition, we have a responsibility to carry on. And now, if this becomes a part of an Article 5, we become the part of, we're forced to become a NATO a responsible member and come to the aid of France. I think one of the issues that we have to do first and foremost is on the intelligence side is to ensure that the lines of communications are open and that our investigations into possible international operations, which this was, may not hit Canadian territories or those of our allies. So we have an intelligence responsibility to keep abreast of those events in the dark world of terror. Secondly, we have right now Canadians that are deployed under CAN-SOFCOM to training missions in Iraq. In Iraq with the Kurds. So I see that as a mission that we may expand upon, and quite rightly so. The Kurds are really the bulwark doing the heavy lifting on the ground, and quite frankly, ourselves and the Americans and other coalitional allies are doing everything they can to assist the Kurds in this. Secondly, although our Air Force is deployed, and although we're supposed to be departing momentarily, I think there may be a great deal of discussion in relation to Canada's air participation, and we may have to look at that very seriously, particularly now with the gravity of the situation. And I think at some point, NATO and the coalition that is against ISIS have got to get together and really sort out a strategy. Now, this strategy is going to have to incorporate regional members, because once you bring Western forces on the ground, it's reminiscent of the Crusades, and this becomes an attraction for ISIS, because that's what they would like us to do, to draw us in to that. But at the same side, we have to be very cognizant that part of that strategy, by projecting attacks into Europe, it generates an anti-Muslim sensibilities within Pegida, that organization, not to mention right-wing political groups that and neo-Nazi groups that would like to see Muslims extricated out of Europe. So I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't alienate those Muslims that are neutral or peace-loving or being assimilated into European society. But at the same time, they also have a responsibility to souse out, if you will, those individuals who may be turning to the dark side of the Islamist cause. Well, the ISIS strategy in this case was basically well executed. I mean, it's viewed that up to 20 people were involved. You had the players, what we call the triggermen, at the very beginning. And what did it do? It caused a lot of terror. It turned Europe upside down, not only Paris. It shook the foundations of a peaceable republic, if you will. But what was really intriguing is the amount of, obviously, the logistics, the command and control aspects, which was quite impressive. I've alluded to this before in a number of discussions, that when ISIS took Tikrit, a number of Saddam Hussein's officers joined. Now, they may not like ISIS, but they're definitely against the Shia government in Baghdad. And so they basically brought their skill sets, which is planning, coordination, logistics, knowledge about how to fight, tactics, and strategy to ISIS capability. So there's a number of these officers that are advising and possibly in command, because they are smart enough not to be targeted. So I think that was rather intriguing. And the other issue is they've now developed, apparently, the Department of External Attack Planning, which would be the equivalent of our J3 operations or J5 future operations within the Canadian military or any other NATO force. So obviously they've got planners, they've got logisticians, they've got intelligence. This was well laid out, the route in, route out. I must admit that depending on who you listen to or read, there are still a number of people on the run. And this is going to take about a week, 2 weeks before the smoke clears till we really find out what the true extent of the operations were. But when you look at, the aim was to advertise their capabilities and to attract recruits, as well as to, shall we be a provocatsi, for extreme right-wing elements and anti-Muslim elements to provoke a government response against Muslims. Well, that could still come out, and as I'm greatly concerned about that aspect, because that's what terrorism strategically does, is to basically force the government to become oppressive. I do find it interesting that, not 10 months ago we had the previous attack in Paris that consumed a number of innocents and police officers doing their duty, which was a shock for many. But then, like anything else, we all run to the forefront of the TV cameras, and the politicians like to pontificate that they're all there to support Paris, for example, and France and the French government. But quite frankly, it falls off to the wayside relatively quickly. The numbers and the media coverage, which was instantaneous in that area, did bring it home to a lot of Europeans, and indeed Great Britain and Canada and the United States, the possibilities of such an operation happening on her home turf. And it's all very well and good to sit back and say we're a peaceable kingdom. The fact is that if you go back through our history, we've had numerous terrorist attacks on Canadian territory. If you're even going back to the 70s and 80s, everything from the FLQ to the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, New Armenian Resistance, the Joint Commandos for the Armenian Genocide, not to mention we've had issues with the IRA, and also cultural organizations during the Yugoslav conflict. So third country problems have resided in here. Not to mention we did have a Sikh problem in Air India. People will remember that, and which was quite frankly the highest kill for one terrorist attack for a number of years. So yes, we are not, shall we say, safeguarded by two shores in the Arctic. The fact is that we are a multicultural society, and quite frankly, there are elements within those multicultural societies and elements that make up that do bring home third-party issues.